All right, let's get this Twitter mailbag started. The first question is by Zach Machuma on Twitter, and he asks, "What's your opinion on fighters wanting more money?" So this is a bit of a broad question, a very loaded one that could very well require 20-minute, 30-minute explanation and sort of something a little bit more in depth. But just my overall thoughts on this, it's getting pretty interesting, I must say. Usually, fighters that complained about pay, throughout the history of the UFC, which obviously this hasn't been a new thing. Fighters have complained about it. There's usually been fighters towards the lower end of the spectrum as far as the pay scale. Usually, the guys that made a lot of money seemed apparently to be happy with what they were making, or they were just simply not going publicly and criticizing the UFC for it. But it seems right now there's a little bit of a turn. You had champ Henry Cejudo retire basically because he had other reasons, but one of the reasons was because he wanted more money. You got one of the biggest stars, Jorge Masvidal, asking for more money, and not only that, but questioning why are the UFC fighters only making 20% of the UFC's revenue, which is sort of the most comprehensive report that we have as far as the UFC financials and revenue split with fighters goes. You also had John Jones taking his sort of negotiations public with the UFC and being critical of Dana White and sort of his pay. So, and even Sean O'Malley, who hasn't really been contentious with the UFC, and he's actually fighting, and he seems to be in good relationship with the UFC. Even he has expressed interest in wanting more money, and this is a guy that's a prospect and up and coming. So you're getting it from kind of all kinds of angles here, and I think it's very interesting. I think fighting, obviously, it's a very dangerous job. It's also a very entertaining job for fans. So it's definitely they should definitely deserve to get compensated because they're putting their lives, their health on the line. And some of the fighters, they go into these fights and they're never the same. So I do believe they should be making more than what they're making now. Now, I do want to throw this sort of argument out there, and I'll just wrap this up really quick. Unlike boxing, which often MMA is being compared to the boxing paydays, boxing promotions don't do, it feels to me that they don't do as much legwork as the UFC does. The UFC has, media days, open workouts, and the UFC seems to have sort of a much more well-oiled and much more complex machine as far as what they offer to fighters and promoting fighters and getting them out there. So I think that should be acknowledged. And something interesting that Jorge Masvidal said was, look, I don't know if we're even asking for 50-50, but I think even if you gave us 30% of the revenue, which would be a 50% increase than what they're making right now, I think most of us would be happy. That's what Jorge Masvidal said, and I think I kind of agree with that. I'm not saying 30% is the number, but certainly I'm not saying 50% isn't either. But I also think we should consider sort of the UFC's efforts here in promoting the athletes and how much money they invest in just running their organization and everything they do for their fighters. So I don't know exactly where the line is, to be honest, to answer your question, Zach, but I would say much higher than 20%. All right, now let's go to the second question, which is asked by Callum K89. He asks, is Burns a tougher matchup stylistically for Usman compared to Masvidal? So great question. This entire time we thought that Masvidal was going to challenge champ Kamaru Usman for his welterweight title. It seemed that was set on stone. They've talked about it for months. It was in the works, etc., etc., etc. Then out of nowhere, we saw the negotiations go sour, which we talked about in the previous question. And at the same time, you had Gilbert Burns sort of come up through the rankings real quick, picking up a huge knockout win over Damian Maia in March, then recently dismantling former champion Tyron Woodley. And all of a sudden, he's the number one contender. So he slid in there and took Masvidal's spot. So this is a good question because they're both very distinct fighters. I would say that Masvidal is sort of the most distinct fighters from the guys that champ Kamaru Usman has fought as far as title fights go. And I would say Burns is, more along the lines of a Tyron Woodley, more along the lines of a Colby Covington. I think given the fact that, he has a good wrestling and heavy on the grappling, it seemed those styles are kind of similar. Where Masvidal's not really a wrestler. He's more of a boxer and will pick you apart, but he could do a little bit of everything. So I was looking forward to seeing new looks challenge champ Kamaru Usman, but certainly you got to acknowledge that Burns is a worthy opponent and somebody that could eventually, win the title for sure. So, good question. I would actually say that I would say that Burns might be a slight of a bigger challenge than Jorge Masvidal. We've seen Jorge Masvidal have struggles with superior grapplers, with stronger guys such as Damian Maia, right? It's believed by many experts that maybe, Usman is able to pin him down against the cage and kind of shut his game down using his wrestling. Now against Durinho Burns, that's a little bit of a different story because Burns, just proved that he can sort of wrestle with a really good wrestler when he did against Tyron Woodley. And at the same time, he's improved his striking. And if you do happen to take him to the ground, well, guess what? He's got world-class jiu-jitsu. So I do find, I think styles make fights. I'm not necessarily saying that Burns might be a better fighter than Usman, but I think over the course of 5 rounds, Burns might pose a little bit of a threat over champ Kamaru Usman than Jorge Masvidal would. But again, Masvidal's evolution recently has been so quick and so great that it's a hard question to answer. But for now, I would say Burns is the biggest threat. All right, now the final question was asked by Tim Beatons. Hopefully I pronounced that right, Tim. Sorry about that. And he asks, Sean O'Malley and Demetrius Johnson are heavy twitchers and gamers. Could gaming improve your real-life fight game? As it is proven that it improves your reaction speed and overall cognitive skills. So I'm a gamer myself. I play a lot of video games. I play a lot of FIFA 20 or whatever. FIFA's the latest, obviously 20 right now. I'm looking forward to the FIFA 21 in September. Play a lot of Warzone, play a lot of Fallout, play a lot of Fortnite. I mean, you name it. Play a lot of video games. And I'm not really a professional fighter, but I would say this. Those guys, especially the guys that are really into gaming, I do believe that it just improves their overall life. If you're really into something and you're able to do that, you're overall just a happier person. It's a good, video games are a very, very good distraction out of, stress and all these other things. So apart from the actual, strength that it gives you in your fingers and the cognitive skills, as you mentioned there, Tim, I do believe that, people that are into it and are able to do it heavily, like Demetrius Johnson and Sean O'Malley, it just improves their overall life. And I'm sure it's a good rewind and a good sort of unwinding moment when they play video games and kind of forget about the tough training session they had. They just chill. It's not really a big effort to play video games. It's not like you're doing something physical. So I do think it helps them out on that end. Now, as far as the MMA skills, I think it depends on what kind of game you play. I mean, we've seen champ Max Holloway, another big gamer, say how he actually started getting into MMA and learning his first, experiences in MMA were learning how to kick from the UFC video game, and he would actually look at the technique in the video game and go do it. So certainly it worked for Max Holloway. Look where he's at now. So so I would say there's a little bit of truth to that. I know I'm a little biased because I'm a gamer, but I do believe video games could have an impact on your overall life and maybe your MMA skills as well.